Hey, welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Valentino Stoll,
Hey now.
Charles Maxwood from Top End Devs. I just started barely recording some Ruby Clips videos. Those are kind of like Rails casts. So go check that out. We have a special guest this week, and that is Alec Larsen. Alec, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm Alec. I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm currently a staff engineer at Procore, which is a company that makes construction management software.
Okay.
And yeah, I think is there anything else you want to know about me?
No, I don't think so. I found the Motion project, which is something that you worked on in the past, and it looked interesting as far as like being able to, with view components and things, add a bunch of stuff to your application and then be able to, I guess, kind of what Turbo does now, where you can update pieces of your UI as you go. Anyway, you want to talk about what it does? I think I kind of botched that up pretty good. And then kind of explain where things sit now with that kind of technology, because I know you said before the call that you're not working on it anymore, and so I'd love to see what you were using now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk a little bit about maybe the history of it and how it came about. So this is a few years ago, like circa 2020, which seems like ancient history somehow. I suppose it isn't actually that long ago. But there was a new technology that had just come out called stimulus reflex, and I was absolutely delighted by it. I think excellent work was done there. I have had this, I don't want to say prejudice, but just this for a long time, until very recently, actually, I had this disposition that JavaScript is just difficult to write. And I had a strong background in Ruby and Rails, and I felt a lot more proficient solving problems in Ruby. And so when I saw stimulus reflex and I saw the ability to create rich front-end experiences with less JavaScript, I was really excited. And I was also excited because I feel like there are differences between the client and server that are actually really relevant when building certain kinds of experiences. So for example, if you want to build a chat, right? You basically end up writing two applications, one for the client and one for the server. And the primary reason why, in my view, is that you need to share information between all of the devices. And there isn't one, and the only place you can do that is in the server's environment, because you need access to something like a database. But all of the UI code has to run on the client. So to make this a little bit more concrete, if you build a chat application, probably you're going to have some code that when the user clicks a button, it reads something from a text box and it writes some message to a WebSocket channel. And then, on the other side, you're going to have the server listen for that message and then, broadcast it to all of the clients. And maybe you want to also have it put that message inside of a database. So you really you have these two applications connected by an API, even though as a developer, you really only want to write one thing. And something like stimulus reflex sort of solves that by allowing you to respond to things that are happening on the client in code that runs on the server. So suddenly it's a lot easier to, as soon as the user does something, write it to the database or broadcast a set of changes, because it's all of the code is running in one trusted execution context. So I really liked that about stimulus reflex. However, at the same time, GitHub was really pushing View Component, and I think they still are. I'm not as plugged into the Ruby on Rails world anymore, but I think View Component is still a pretty big thing. And at that time, it seemed like it was going to be a bigger thing than I think it ultimately turned out to be. There were some pull requests going into Rails, and actually, I was under the impression that perhaps View Component would be, or something like View Component, some minimal subset of View Component would be incorporated into the Rails framework. what ended up happening was more that uh, action view was extended in a way to make it so that view component could be written without monkey patching, which I think is a good compromise. But the component style of writing UI, I don't think is really like that doesn't really have first class support inside of the Rails framework. But at the time, it seemed like it might. It seemed like this like UI paradigm that we had seen in the JavaScript world of having components, which I really liked, was going to come to the Rails world. And at the same time, we were seeing this like, responding to things inside of UI on the server. And I thought, what we really need is some technology that'll let us take view components and use and have code run on the server in response to events that's like scoped to that component, and also have state that's scoped to that component. And that last bit about state is what I really think made motion different. And I can talk about that. But I guess before I do, I feel like I kind of went on a long, meandering thing. Did that make sense? Is there anything you want to dig into there?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I completely follow along. I haven't used Stimulus Reflex. I know the guys that initially wrote it, but yeah, I guess the part of it that I don't completely understand is so what you're trying to do is you're trying to have view components that within the component, and I understand the components. I talk to people in the React community quite a bit, actually, even though I don't write a whole lot of React. But anyway, so yeah, when there's an event in the component on the client, then they have React hooks and things like that handle a lot of that stuff, right? And they'll manage state, whatever. And so what you're looking for is you're looking for having some way of having that trickle into the server so that the server can respond to it, and then over a WebSocket or something send a response back so that the client can then react to whatever happened on the server. Is that more or less what we're looking at? Or
Yeah, that's right. And it's worth noting that at the time, Stimulus Reflex was doing something like that at the page level. And
right.
I want to be careful. There were other. It was possible to extend Stimulus Reflex in a way to make it not work at the page level. So it's not as though this was like a fundamental limitation to Stimulus Reflex, but I wanted to make something that would specifically make it easier to have view component style components be able to work in this way. So I really wanted like little classes with state that could with methods where you could bind methods on that class to things happening in the front end and update that state and re-render the component, and then continue in that way, similar to how React works.
Right. Okay.
And so at that time, I was fortunate. Unabridged Software was my employer at the time, and actually, you'll see this project is underneath their scope. Right. They were kind enough to indulge me in this. Basically, they were like, "Let's do it." We were working on a relatively large application where we thought that this might have some benefit. There was interest in using Vue component. And separately, there had been interest in React, but we were already using a large Rails monolith. So we were wondering, could we get some of the benefits of React inside of our existing Rails code base? And so in this way, this project was born. And it was a fun project for a long period of time, or I guess maybe not a super long period of time, a few months. It got some attention. Some people used it, but it ultimately, I think, has been kind of like as the ecosystem evolved, it became possible to do a lot of the things that Motion does in other ways with sort of like more mainstream solutions. So now I'm thinking of like Hotwire and Turbo, and there were also some limitations with like this design and how Vue component works. That means that it's hard to get. There are some problems that people run into And if you look at the open issues, you'll see them. Things like being able to access like the cookies and the session when the component isn't rendering. Those sorts of problems really go deep into how Rails was extended to support Vue components. And in order to solve those, we'd probably have to leave Vue component behind, which was one of the major design goals of the project, was to sort of bring reactivity to Vue component. So
Right.
if we ultimately have an API that isn't compatible with Vue component anymore, it's like, what's the point of the project? There maybe are some other ways to solve it, but I didn't quite see a way. So I think at this point, if I'm being like totally transparent and honest, I would say that if you're looking for the kind of reactivity that motion provides, like in particular components that have state, and then like, or you just want to have, if you just want to have something running on the server and responding to what's going on the client, and you want to use Ruby and Rails, then I think Turbo is probably your best bet. Turbo and Hotwire and those modern frameworks, they're like well supported by the ecosystem, and they can accomplish that. To the best of my knowledge, and I'm not as familiar with these since I haven't been using Ruby on Rails in the past couple of years. I'm not as familiar with how far you can push these. I don't think by default there's an easy way to have what I would call stateful components, and by that I mean like the user interacts with a component and just that one component on the page re-renders. Like something like that, I don't think is quite as easy to do with Turbo. And I think if you want the property of, you have nested components and the parent component is allowed to re-render, but the child component state is preserved across the parent re-rendering, I think that in particular, I don't know if in Turbo's paradigm it's possible. I don't know of a way to do that. But if you want something like that, then actually I think what you're looking for has now come to the React ecosystem in the form of server components. And so, it's actually been super interesting seeing like the JavaScript ecosystem move towards the server, and the like Ruby on Rails being like the server ecosystem move towards the client. And I feel like we're kind of meeting in the middle. And it's just it's really interesting, like having worked in both in different times of my career. For the longest time, I was working on Ruby on Rails applications. We were talking about SEO and being able to just link to a section in the app, or being able to like refresh the page and keep your state, and accessibility, right? Like you can tab around. You can use a screen reader. And these were all things that kind of you just got for free if you used standard browser components with HTML. And it was easy to do that in like a form-based, full page refresh server situation that you would build by default with Ruby on Rails. But it didn't have as much pizzazz as you could get with JavaScript. You know what I mean? And so I feel like it's been interesting to watch this. The server rendered frameworks have sort of been making their way towards the client, and at the same time, React has been making its way towards the server. And yeah, like I said, I think now they've met in the middle. If you're on the server side, if you want to be primarily server side, and you want to reach out to the client, then I think something Turbo with Ruby on Rails is a really good solution. If you're primarily on the client side and want to do a few things on the server, then I think React Server Components and Nest.js is a great solution. And so I don't know, it's really cool. I feel like for a long time these two communities were kind of in competition with each other, but we've kind of ended up with parallel solutions, and it's been really fun to see that growth.
Yeah, what we're talking about here. let's take a little step back, right? Because we keep saying components. And they do mean different things, right? On both the client and server side, right? Because the Rails side has shaped it to now GitHub at taking advantage of the naming Vue component, and the front end is taking advantage of the browser API of web components, right? And really, they all mean web components for the browser. It's just kind of how they're manipulated.
I don't. Well, I think it depends on the framework you're using. The word in React, I think component, it refers to a concept from their framework that has both. Yeah. It's like an encapsulated section of the view with internal state.
But it just renders a DOM, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't. Web components are a separate thing that's actually
Yeah,
built into the browser that React, to my knowledge, doesn't make use of currently.
yeah, there's a web component standard that it's kind of, it seems like it comes a little bit into vogue and then people move away from it again, and then I've heard people talking a bit more about it lately, so people are seeing the capabilities there. But yeah, effectively, a web component is a way of encapsulating DOM together that is an actual standard in HTML5. And then right, and then with view components, it's even different there because um, right, there isn't encapsulated state like there is in React unless you put it into DOM elements in some kind of like data property or something like that, which is actually how Stimulus and Turbo manage the data, right? They stick it into the DOM element. So largely the idea is the same in the sense that it's, hey, there's this area of the, I want to say the board. I've been playing too many board games, but this area of the web page that, functions as a unit, and we expect everything here to kind of travel and mutate as a unit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's ultimately about, to use buzzwords, encapsulation and composability. It's about limiting the states in the, well, and I think where it comes from is when you interact with an application visually, you kind of see components,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you see a little. Obviously, you see elements on the page. You see like a text box, but like I
Right.
logically perceive like a little chat window with a send button as a kind of like component.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know. It's a way of thinking about how applications are divided, where the goal, I suppose, is to something like divide and conquer your state via visual hierarchy. And so I think that works very well for user interfaces, actually, which
Yeah.
is why frameworks like not just React, but Solid.js, Svelte. I think Phoenix Live View internally uses a component style architecture, so that's a non-client side
I don't know for sure.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know for sure either.
I know
So
it
I think
uses WebSockets, kind of like what we were talking about before.
yes, yeah. Um, yeah, I really shouldn't speak on it because I guess I don't know. I know somebody who's used it and I've heard them talk about it, but I don't want to garble what they say, not having used it myself.
Yeah, we have the Elixir Mix podcast, so if people want to go learn more about that, we've had plenty of people, including Chris McCord, come on and talk about it. But what I think is interesting here, and the way that I get around at least some of this, I mean, even talking back to the server, right, is I'll just put a stimulus controller on my application or on my view component, right, and then I have Rails serve the controller up using import maps, and then right it. But what it winds up doing is it winds up looking through the DOM and kind of hydrating after the fact whatever HTML I sent through on my web page, and then from there I can tell Stimulus to do certain things with my application. I can have it transform different things, whether it's changing visibility for like a menu drop down or whether it's replacing one section of page with the other, though Turbo's a better use for that in a lot of cases. But you get the idea. It's the same kind of thing. And so what Stimulus Reflex does is it lets you set up action cable, and then it does the back and forth over the WebSocket, which, let's face it, it is a little nicer than using Ajax. It's a little more responsive and things like that. But ultimately, you can achieve the same kind of thing without having to have a React or Angular kind of take over that part of the page and manage every aspect of it. Which is why I go that way. But that's the thing that's beautiful about what we do too, is that there's so many ways to solve it. And so, if you want to build server components and I guess just regular components in React, and you want it to work that way, you can, and it's a pretty elegant solution that way too.
Yeah. Although I will say, I actually think there's like a design, and this is maybe a little bit theoretical, there's like a design difference between something like React server components or like React proper and what you would do with Turbo. And that is
Yes.
that you're sort of, everything is sort of separated into, I'm trying to think about the best way to explain this. Like everything is sort of separated into verticals. So like you have your controller with like some code, and then maybe you have like some other like component with some code, and then you have like some HTML, and it's like the code is in a different file than the HTML. It's completely separate.
Hmm.
And then that HTML like maybe goes to get another file for JavaScript. Like everything is grouped by technology, and sort of like responsibility rather than by the function that you actually perceive on the
Hmm.
page as a user. So if you want to get a full experience, you kind of have to like, I don't know, you kind of have to go through the entire request response, event cycle, binding all of these separate pieces together. And at each step along the way, you have to keep track of what part of the page you're updating, and then I don't know, actually do that update. I think even like surgically. So when you're talking about like stimulus
Hmm.
reflex, and I can't remember what the name of the thing is. The action there's this like action table that gives you like helpers for making page updates based on selectors.
Yeah, the
Uh,
turbo streams.
is it just
Yeah.
called turbo streams?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's
I
all
mean,
consolidated.
yeah.
Yeah.
So like turbo streams,
Yeah.
those are like surgical updates. So there's no unified concept of like an encapsulated component. At any place along there, you could accidentally reach outside of the component and update something else on the page. And actually, you as a developer have to like make effort to stay within the component. I think. Does
Um,
that
I,
sound right?
that it kind of depends. So, um, stuff like stimulus or turbo, they put pretty good guardrails around it. You don't have to go way out of your way to avoid touching stuff that's outside the scope of what you put your turbo tag or your stimulus controller around. But all of that said, you are correct in the sense that, and for me, it's not necessarily like, oh, um, does the browser have to go and get this JavaScript and then do the work and then, update the DOM and now it's got a separate HTML. I don't worry about that. For me, it's the mental model, right? It's keeping track of all the stuff. And I do have to say that having all of the stuff in one JSX file, it is pretty convenient. I know that's sacrilege to some of my Ruby friends that I actually like JSX because it blends both technology syntax. You actually have HTML or what looks like HTML inside of your JavaScript functions and stuff like that. But all of that aside, the fact that I could just edit one component in one file and at the end of the day I have one thing that does it, it is pretty darn nice.
Yeah, it sort of puts the encapsulation boundary around the piece of functionality that's
Yeah.
facing the user rather than, I don't know, the individual like steps of the process.
Yeah,
Like,
ultimately for me, it's if I have to go and modify it, I don't have to modify three places. I can just modify one place.
Yeah, I mean, revisiting GitHub's View component, right? Like, I like you was I thought that, oh, this is the real solution to
I
the
still
front end
use them. I love
components.
them.
They're good, they are
yeah,
great, but it's still like you have to like kind of hodgepodge together Ruby code with the DOM, and then
yeah.
also they have a
Yeah.
separate like JavaScript stuff for when you want to
You-
sprinkle some in. It's just like still doesn't like it's not cohesive, right?
Well,
yeah.
so
Well,
it is and it's not. I mean, it gets as close as it can without putting it in the same file because I always use the sidecar setup for my components, which
I mean,
means that I have a Ruby file and then I have a folder with all the stuff, the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript. If I'm adding those to the component. So at the end of the day, what I wind up with is okay, I need to modify my header component. I know it's either in that one Ruby file that's in the components folder or it's in that sidecar folder where I can go and edit the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And sure, it's not all in the same file, but at least I can go find it all in the same place. I don't have to open up app models and then app views and then whatever.
mhm.
yeah, I mean, revisiting the live view from Phoenix, right? Like that I thought, oh, like okay, Rails is going to adopt a similar pattern where we just have a connection to a component and
Mhm.
stream any updates or destroy the connection if it no longer needs it on the page, right? Like we would have
Hmm.
this similar features because it seemed like that was the cohesive step, right? Like because you have a DOM chunk that represents a component and the server manages it remotely through a connection to the client, and
Mhm.
that that all just works itself out through the framework. And it just seemed like we're slowly getting there again with all of this hotwire stuff, but that's still not there on the rail side.
I feel like to give like a concrete example that I feel like everyone can relate to, like imagine you want to build a form and you want to reuse that form in different parts of your application, and you want that form to validate itself as the user is entering data. That in the current like Ruby on Rails model is a little bit tricky to do. View component can get you to a place where, like, I mean, to be fair, a partial can get you to the place where you have a reusable form. But that, like, especially if you don't want to like repeat you want to use the validations that are on your model, right? Like, it's not like you want to write separate front end validations. You want to validate in the same way the server would, maybe after maybe after the field blurs or something, maybe not every key press. That I think is a little tricky to do. You could have a view component, and then the view component could contain like a turbo stream, right? And then you could have you could have that listen to a channel that's unique for each user. And then I think you'd still have to have a controller where you actually took the logic, or you using stimulus reflex, you'd have to have a reflex, right? Where it's like on blur, you'd have a method, and that method would sort of have to re-render either the view component or the partial and publish it to that user's channel, right? Like you have to coordinate all of this together yourself.
So that's how the turbo streams work, kind of now. Is so that you can kind of like say, okay, here's a turbo stream signed for this user for this particular thing, and it does stream it there, but it still is like you have to have that wired up on the server and the client still, right? Like we have a view that has the tie back to the server.
Yeah, the other way you could do it is with stimulus, right? So you have a blur function for each of the fields, and so when you blur off the field, right? Yeah, it makes an end run call, either over the WebSocket or via Ajax, and then comes back and updates the class.
What does it do with that blur? So are you writing JavaScript that then makes a request to an endpoint that is dedicated to re-render that form no matter where it is in the application?
No,
or how do
what you would do is, or the way I would do it is, I would have it send the request. Whether I'm validating, it depends on if I'm validating the entire form or just that one field. But effectively, what I would do is I would pass the data down via Ajax. I would just send a JSON of the form data. And then when it sends a response back, I would have it send back a JSON response, and then I would just add the class and any text that I have to the to the DOM. And Stimulus has some really nice DOM modification stuff, so you can slot stuff in above or below or around or wherever. You can re-render just a little piece, but you can also add classes to targets. And so what you would do is you would make each of your fields a target. And so it would pull the data from the target, send it to the server, bring it back, and then update the target.
That makes sense. Yeah. So it's all definitely possible, but it sounds like there's some manual, there's still some manual targeting. Like I don't know, I call it surgical updates. Like there's still you still have to update. You have to know. You can't just have you can't just have a partial that says this is the state I want, and then I don't know, have it be replaced with that new state.
You could.
Okay. And then can you share that anywhere in the application? Could you reuse that form? Okay. Hey, that's great. Then yeah, the motion is completely obsolete. That was the thing that I wanted at the time that I created it.
Yeah, but you would have to use something like Turbo, like Valentino's talking about, where it, you enter it, it sends it down, sends back up hey, these are still the errors that are there, or, right, you would have to, it does require that end run to the server unless you want to duplicate your validation logic somewhere.
That's interesting. I know Turbo isn't technically tied to Rails, but I always hear about it in a Rails context. Have either of you seen HTMX at all, or looked at HTMX?
Yes. We had Carson on the show. Did we have him on this show, or was it on JavaScript Jabber?
I think it must have been JavaScript Jabber.
We had him on JavaScript Jabber last year. We had him on this show, but it was a long, long time ago when he first put it out there, before it was cool. And so, maybe we're a little ahead of our time, but yeah, HTMX is really cool.
Well, I think this trend in the JavaScript ecosystem, it is predated, I feel like, by all the like backend frameworks. So yeah, it's cool to see it
Yep.
unified together. I mean, it is funny because HTMX is, I look at it and I'm like, oh, it's very similar to Turbo. It's kind of like Turbo, but not tied to Rails.
Yeah, it's pretty slick, to be honest. I'm gonna go find that episode so we can drop it into the yeah, so we talked to him in 2023. We also talked to him about it in 2021 when he had first switched over from Intercooler. So I'll put both those links in the chat and in the show notes. But yeah, it's definitely cool stuff. I think it got popularized more recently by the Primogen on YouTube.
Yeah, that checks out. Yeah, YouTube dev content has gotten really good. Appreciate that for sure.
Primogen's funny too. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like I should get more involved. It's unfortunate, you start doing stuff for work and I don't know. I find anyway that when I do stuff for work, it kind of like uses up the part of my brain that maybe I would do recreational programming with. I don't know.
Yeah.
I kind of get done with work and I'm like, every now and then something really speaks to me. I'll spend time on it, but I do want to get back into the Ruby on Rails ecosystem and see what has happened in the past couple of years that I've been away. It sounds like some really cool stuff has been done, and yeah, I wonder how close you can get to the experience I want with just off the shelf standard framework things. Now it sounds like you can get really close, so that's great to hear.
It kind of depends on what you consider off the shelf standard framework stuff, right? Because some people consider things like Stimulus and Turbo, beyond kind of how Rails uses them without you really doing anything about it. Like Turbo, for example, Turbo's built into Rails, and so if you build a Rails app and you make a request to the server, it uses Turbo to do that, and it only re-renders the parts of your page that changed, right, without you doing anything. But a lot of people with the stuff beyond that, yeah, they don't consider that, I guess, vanilla Rails, but it's definitely heading that way. And if you look at DHH's talk from Rails World, he really goes into a lot of that stuff and says, hey, now we have these areas of functionality with Turbo, right? So I think it was Turbo, was it Turbo Frames? There was some aspect of Turbo that was just barely added. Right.
Yeah, there's like a whole morphing thing that was actually borrowed from Stimulus Reflex.
That
was recently added.
Yeah, there was some drama around that too, but we won't go into that. Anyway, so there's that. There's Strata, Turbo Native. We had Joe Mazzalotti on to talk about how Rails apps essentially can get wrapped up to provide a mobile app experience kind of a thing. I'm also interviewing him for the Ruby Dev Summit in February. So anyway, there's all kinds of cool stuff. So if you're looking to get back into the Rails ecosystem and see what's going on with a lot of this stuff, I'd start there. There's some other kind of more internal stuff like with the Solid Cache and Solid Queue that are worth looking at, but those aren't in the realm that we're talking about here.
So you mentioned before, Alec, like if you've gone away from Rails and more into the client side. I'm curious, like how a lot of this stuff has evolved on the front end side, because I'm very disconnected, I guess, from like the whole Next.js movement. What have you seen from there that maybe is like you see as like huge advantage? Like, because to me, I see anytime like there's like a point at which like the application becomes so client heavy that it's like, why do you have all this other stuff that when you could just use the same thing for the server? Like, where is your like, well, I have to use this, right?
Well, actually, before I answer that question, if you don't mind, I want to say one thing really quickly, which is I think that the Rails, I think that Turbo is still ahead of like React and like what's currently going on in the client world in with things like Action Cable and streams. It's actually really easy to stream things and have like real time applications in Ruby on Rails. I think it's still easier to do that in Ruby on Rails than it is in anything that I currently know of with React. Like it's just I think it's just easier. Like obviously Socket IO has been around for a long time and stuff, but you have to wire that all up manually. Whereas like with turbo frames, it's pretty easy to have something where it's like, I just want to have this be live for all the users of my application. And so that's pretty neat.
I think you're kind of there. I have to admit, I haven't played with them, but Remix and Redwood JS both are playing in this space where they have the front end and the back end that are made to talk to each other.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think now that I mention it, I think Redwood JS uses Prisma, and that's actually HTTP calls. It's not a stream. But I think Remix, they were working on some stuff with the streams, and I don't know how much.
I haven't used Remix, so maybe to go back to answering your question, Valentino, like what do I think is really cool about the front end world currently? I think this reactive, it's happened in a couple of different frameworks. Like it happened in Solid.js, I feel like, with the server $ syntax, and then React added the use server directive. This like idea of having one code base where you have some code that's running on the server and some code that's running on the client, and it's just and making a request to the server is just a function call away. I think that's a huge productivity win.
That is,
and
yeah.
It does have some like big downsides. The main one is accidentally leaking secrets. Like if you have like environment variables that are in your bundle or something, it's really easy to accidentally have your client bundle include privileged information that's only supposed to be available in your server environment. But there are ways around that. Next.js has like this thing where you have to like prefix all of your environment variables with like public or something, or else they can't possibly be included in client builds, which is a nice workaround. So I think in the JavaScript world, I think deployment is a lot easier than my experience. Like Vercel has made it so easy to just like have and Netlify too, to just have a GitHub repo, and you can just immediately start building something that like works using React. And then it's like, do you need to do something privileged? MBD, add a little directive to your function. It can even be in the same file. And now that code runs at the edge on a server, right? Mm-hmm. And it has, and it can connect to your database and stuff. But from your client, it just looks like you're making a function call. I think that's really, really cool.
I want to push back on that too. I agree. I really like what Guillermo and those guys over at Vercel. I've been to Netlify's offices a handful of times because they're just, I've been in San Francisco and they're like, come on over. And I did some events and some other things, some videos with them. But it's kind of like the Heroku argument with Ruby and Rails, right? And so you've got the nice Heroku type story for Vercel and Netlify. Incidentally, you can also push Next.js and stuff to Heroku, but that's another thing. Mm-hmm. The thing that's interesting to me, though, about the deployment stories is that I don't see anybody talking about how to deploy this to your own system, right?
Yeah.
So if I want to go and I want to host it on a DigitalOcean droplet that costs me $4 a month, as opposed to, hey, I hit my limit on Vercel or Netlify and now I've got to pay through the nose for this. That's the same issue that we ran into with Heroku. And so, the Vercel story is slick. It is so nice. And if you're doing serverless functions, then they've got that nailed down. And the Heroku setups and things like that, or if you're deploying on your own, that is trickier for sure. But all in all, I think it depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah, well, and I will say, I do think there. This is not even like a unique to me hot take, but this is a hot take. So take it with a grain of salt. I think that people will often talk about how Next.js is tied to Vercel and it's difficult to deploy anywhere but Vercel. But I think the Heroku example with Ruby on Rails is really analogous. It's not that Rails is really difficult to deploy anywhere. It's not, there's not something evil going on with Heroku. It's just that it's kind of difficult to set up infrastructure and deploy applications. And I think the same thing is true of Next.js. These are really elaborate infrastructures that you can, in principle, set up. And that can be complicated. And if it is, then you have this, this great, you can pay Vercel to do it for you. But the Next.js framework, like it is possible to, if you want to do it in its most simple configuration, you can just run it as a node server, right? And it'll serve all the serverless functions and stuff. That's its most naive configuration, because if you were going to run that, you'd probably have to have like an EC2 instance that's just constantly using resources, running as a node server, or but
that's just like us running Puma behind Nginx.
Exactly. You can run it like you would run a traditional Rails application. What gets a little bit more complicated is if you wanted to like actually set up the Lambda functions yourself.
Yeah.
But again, that's complicated because, let's be real, AWS is really complicated. I literally, so much of my, I work on, it's called developer environments, but a lot of my job intersects with configuring AWS, and it's just very complicated. And so that's not Next.js's fault. It's just very complicated. You have to build you have to do a little separate bundle for each one of the server functions. You have to figure out how to like upload the server functions, and then you probably want to automate all of that. And there's a million ways to do everything on AWS depending on how your policies are set up. So I don't know. I guess my hot take is I think that Next.js does the best it possibly can at being able to be deployed somewhere other than Vercel. It's just hard to deploy that architecture.
Yeah, lately I've been using Kamal to deploy my Rails apps, and I've been tempted to see if I can essentially run my what would be Lambda functions, right? Except they might be a Rails app written in Rhoda or Sinatra or something, or even in Opal. I don't know. You might be able to do Opal on Lambda since it transpiles. Yeah. Anyway, but just see if there's a way to deploy those with Kamal as well, so that it's like, hey, just stand up this little app and then just, run it out there on its own endpoint. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's interesting to see what the options are and where the limits are. And I can tell you, I'm in a Discord where we discuss Kamal, and people struggle with it all the time. I think in some ways,
what is Kamal? Is it like can you just briefly, I guess I could Google it, but what is it? Is it a deployment tool? Does it like configure infrastructure? Does it use Docker? Or I don't know.
It uses Docker. So effectively the difference is Capistrano. You're probably more familiar with that if you
or like Mina Capistrano, like SSH into boxes.
SSH into your box and run a bunch of commands. What Kamal does is it builds a Docker container. It pushes it into a container repository, and then it pulls it down to the server you're deploying it to. And it basically, stands it up and then kills the other one when it gets a health check back from the one you're standing up. And so,
is it fair to say it's an alternative to Kubernetes then? It kind of sounds like a container orchestration layer sort of thing.
No, it doesn't really do a whole lot of container orchestration like Kubernetes does. It literally just goes into the machine and uses the Docker utility in Linux and says, okay, we're going to stand up this server. It does the health checks. And then once the health checks check out and it's ready to cut over, then it cuts it over and kills the old Docker container.
Yeah.
And it's pretty slick, but it's a little more of a mind bend when you run into trouble, because with Capistrano, it would crap an error out right into your, sorry, the way I put it, but it would put an error right into your console, right? Instead of with Kamal, sometimes the problem exists on the Docker container. And yes, you can connect to the Docker container using Kamal, but it's not always as straightforward how you figure out where the issue is or what the problem was.
Yeah, and that's really the dark side of encapsulation. Like it's kind of interesting. It makes it harder, I feel like, or maybe not encapsulation, isolation, right? Like it's why I don't like using Docker for development. Maybe like separate services that an application uses, like a Postgres server or something. I'll run that in a container. But when I'm developing an application, I don't want to run my Rails server in development mode with a bind mouse between the files. I'd rather just run the server locally because it makes it so much easier to connect to and debug and figure out what's going on. I can see how I don't know, that would carry over to deployments too. When you have stuff in containers, it seems like it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly what's going on.
Yeah, sometimes, but the deployment is a lot cleaner. And
Hmm.
at the end of the day, it turned out to be a lot easier to manage my stuff. And if I need to scale it up, I just give it another server to deploy to, and it'll put one on there too, and load balance the whole thing. So,
Yeah. Have
and
you?
that's the issue I don't see as much with the front end focused alternatives like Next or even in Vue with Nuxt or whatever, is that if I want to deploy it somewhere other than these, Netlify and Vercel and Heroku, they have the recipe. And so they just pour the recipe out and it's done, which is really nice. But sometimes I just don't want to pay for that for my side project. And I'd rather just throw it, like I said, on a
Yeah.
$5 a month server. And so that's the trade off that I'm talking
How
about is
have you looked at Vercel's and Netlify's pricing? I'm curious how active your side project is. For what it's worth, I don't know how sustainable this is. For all I know, these are VC-backed companies where their long-term plan is to turn around and raise their
that's true. They
prices.
do have a free
But
tier.
but as it stands right now, they have a very generous free tier.
Yeah.
Like I've found in the few things that I've deployed that I've not needed to pay anything. But I mean, I don't know. I'm not building anything that's blowing up. So
Also,
So
that's today. Or
yeah,
Heroku was the same way.
sure,
yeah.
yeah,
So
exactly. So maybe they kind of want to lock you in, and then they'll sure.
so top end devs before it was top end devs when it was devchat.tv. I had built the whole site on 11D and I had
Mhm.
deployed it to Netlify and I had a deal with them, a sponsorship deal. And so I was getting some of my hosting discounted and it was still super expensive and it was exceptionally difficult for me to troubleshoot on Netlify. Now, that may change and it may be different with something like Next.js because I haven't used it for quite a while. But that was the other thing hang up that I had is that with something like Kamal or even when I was just, deploying to Puma Nginx on a regular server, I could get into the server and I could see whatever I wanted. And that was the major difference for me too. So but yeah, the I have to say the deployment story on those is super nice because you just hook it up to your Git repo when you're off, you're done.
Yeah, the client like the developer infrastructure contract is really good. Like it's
Mhm.
just yeah, it's very intuitive and it's interoperable between platforms almost at this point. I guess when I say that, I'm thinking between two platforms, Vercel and Netlify. In my experience, maybe there are other ones too that have a similar workflow. Um,
Yeah.
but
But for my
yeah,
production app, it started to cost me real money. So
I see. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the other thing that's kind of like weird about this like server function world is that it's really it's doing databases is just strange. Like it's
Mhm.
like there are different like solutions that are being built to deal with this, but since cloud functions like have to start and stop, they can't really like keep a connection to a database open. So
Right.
like in a normal Node.js app or Rails app, you open up 5 connections to a
Mhm.
Postgres thing, and then you divvy them out per request, check them in, check them out of a connection pool. You can't really do that in server functions because they have to start and stop. So you don't want to spend all your time like negotiating the connection just to then immediately tear it down. Databases just aren't optimized for
Right.
that. So there's this other layer. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it's called Planet Scale. Yeah, Planet
Mhm.
Scale has an HTTP API for making like SQL requests. It's very
Mhm.
interesting, and it's like a direct response to this like need to just really quickly do database requests but not have a good place to put them. So I don't know. That's pretty costly because then you're literally, I think, with Planet Scale, you're paying like um, a combination of like per query and then also like the number of rows in the table or something that
Right.
your query runs against. They have kind of a weird price. It's just my understanding is they have a very generous free tier, but I don't
Mhm.
know if your application got popular. I have no idea how much you would pay. It's kind of
Yeah.
hard to see through that. The infrastructure sort of demands a strange pricing model.
Yeah. Well, Planet Scale is interesting too because I think they're backed onto SQLite.
No, I think Planet Scale, maybe they are. I think Planet Scale is MySQL. I know what you're talking about, though. There's another really cool new thing that came out with SQLite. But I think it uses like it's Rust and SQLite. I think it was in This Week in Rust. I don't think it's Planet Scale. I think there is another.
Maybe it's one of their competitors, but yeah, SQLite.
Is it like TurboDB?
It could be,
Yeah,
but
all right.
but yeah, the SQLite has some interesting limitations too. That I've been talking to Stephen Margheim. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's been doing some interesting stuff with SQLite and Rails, because SQLite has some of the connection limitations where it does sequential writes. I think that's what they called it. So you can only have one thing writing to the database at a time, where Postgres and MySQL can lock part of a table.
Okay.
And all right, and so it can say, don't change anything here, right? And so unless it has to wait for that one piece, it can go write somewhere else too, on one of your other connections. But SQLite doesn't do that. And so anyway, they've had some interesting workarounds with that, but it's been interesting talking about SQLite possibly scaling as well.
Yeah.
Just on a total tangent, since we're off in tangent land anyway.
Yeah. SQLite is really interesting. I think SQLite, like in every configuration that I've seen it, maybe with the exception of this new service that's using SQLite, it writes to a file.
Yes.
Like there's no server. Like your application connects directly to a file. So it makes sense to me that it would have this limitation. It probably has to use the operating system's file locks to.
Yeah.
So probably only one process can mutate things at a time. Yeah.
Yep.
That totally makes sense.
Anyway, he's going to come on in a couple of months and talk to us about that. And I talked to him about it for Ruby Dev Summit as well. But yeah, anyway. I have to jump off actually in like 20 minutes. I'm interviewing Amir Rajan for the Ruby Dev Summit about Dragon Ruby. So yeah, I'm going to kind of segue us back onto track. Is there anything else within the realm of kind of this, front end, back end coordination layer that we haven't talked about that we should cover before we do our picks?
No, I think I'm satisfied. Sorry, I don't have more information. I'm honored to have been on the show. It's cool to talk about something that I built a while ago. Sorry, there isn't more to say about it, but I'm also glad that there's been a lot of innovations both on the client side and the server side. It seems like we're getting some. Seems like no matter which one you choose, you have really great options. And while I still think it is the case that there are benefits to choosing one or the other, those benefits are getting like smaller and smaller. I think we're really quickly getting to a place of parity. So it's just exciting it's an exciting time to be alive.
Awesome. Yep. All right. I'm also just going to throw in, we talked about live view. You can go check out Elixir Mix. There are plenty of episodes on that. If you're interested in React server components, we did episodes on JavaScript Jabber and on React Roundup with Dan Abramov and a few other people. So if you're interested in those topics, you can go check them out. And then I know we're planning on talking about some of the new stuff in Stimulus, Turbo, and Strata, Hotwire in general. And we cover those on a regular basis here. So keep an ear out. And yeah, let's go ahead and do some picks. Valentino, you want to start us off with picks?
Sure. So I've been toying around with the idea of fine tuning and training my own AI models.
Nice.
And I've discovered the Lambda platform, our Lambda Labs. They have GPU workstations you could buy. They're insanely expensive, but I've been eyeing them and maybe pulled the trigger. But either way, I'm going to be building a AI workstation soon, so I can run my own inference on my local network and use AI for our household.
Oh, nice.
Just for some fun. So excited to do that.
Cool. I'm going to jump in with a few picks. I'm going to start out with a board game pick. This is one I picked quite a long time ago. I do a board game every time, Alec, by the way. So this one's called the I always just call it Arnak. What's the name of the game? It's something of Arnak. Lost Ruins of Arnak. There we go. And anyway, it's kind of an interesting game. If you're a board game enthusiast, you kind of get the idea that there are several games. There's like worker placement games where you put your worker on a space and you get stuff back, or it has an effect. There's deck building games. There are economy games. There are tech ladder games. Arnak is all of the above. So Basically, you also get to go explore different areas on the map. Um, but it's got this really nice balance. So if you do a ton of exploration and somebody else does a ton of tech, you can't just say, oh well, that's the way to win it, right? It usually helps to go up the tech ladder at least some, right? But uh, you don't have to do it to win. So if you're fighting somebody else for that distinction, right, you can go pick up points in another area. There's another game that I can't think of off the top of my head that kind of has the same dynamic where there are like 4 or 5 different ways to build points and win. But anyway, it is so fun. My buddies and I, we played it last Wednesday for our game night. Yeah, I think it took us 2 hours with 4 of us, maybe a little longer to play it. It's simple enough that like a teenager could play it. Board Game Geek actually has a weight on it of 2.91 out of 5. And so 2, like I tell everybody, is kind of your semi-complex uh, casual gamer game, right? I think Monopoly's at like a 1. I think Settlers of Catan's around a 2. So that kind of give you an idea. Anyway, so I really, really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed that game so much that I went and got the expansion, and the expansion is just more fun. So anyway, I'm going to pick Lost Ruins of Arnak. A couple of other things, 2 things I'm going to announce real quick. One is the Ruby Dev Summit. I'm going to be releasing the videos for 24 hours in February. So I'm just releasing 5 videos a day for 4 days. And so, yeah, you have to be on top of it to get them. Or if you're a subscriber to Ruby Bits or Rails Clips, then you can get them as part of your subscription. And I'm going to have my team start putting them into the subscription basket early. So you can go watch them early if you want. Because I've already done like 6 or 7 of the interviews. I'm doing 2 more this afternoon. And then I'm doing like 5 or 6 next week. So Valentino's on my list, by the way. So if you want to hear what he thinks about the future of Ruby, go check that out. And then Ruby Clips and Rails Clips. I've been recording videos for those as well. So those are kind of like Rails casts. And the first video I did, I just kind of explained. I just set up a Rails app, and then I kind of told you what I was going to build. Second episode, I actually picked up a Tailwind UI template, but all of their templates are React and Next.js. So what did I do? I went and I translated all of that into Vue components in Ruby on Rails. So because I'm a glutton for punishment and I wanted to do it in Rails. So if you want to see me translate the menu bar at the top from one to the other, it took me about a half hour. You can go check that out. I'm going to do the collapsible mobile menu next, right? So that's going to be the next video I record probably this afternoon. So anyway, super excited about that. And then my wife and I have been watching a show on Netflix, I think. It's called The Diplomat. And it's got Kerry Russell in it. And she gets made the diplomat in England. That happens pretty early. They start out talking about her being the diplomat to Afghanistan. And then she gets reassigned for various reasons. That all happens in the first episode, so I don't feel like I'm giving too much away there. But anyway, so she's managing this crisis, this international crisis, and we've really been enjoying it. I am also going to pick VidAngel. So my wife and I, we've been watching it using VidAngel, and what VidAngel does is it effectively you sign into Netflix with VidAngel, and then you can watch the show on VidAngel, and you can say, I don't want to, like my wife doesn't want to hear any F words, S words, some other words. And so she just tells it, I don't want to hear any of those words. And so what it does is it uses programming. So somebody's watched it and flagged where all those words are, flagged where the nudity is, flagged where the sex scenes are, flagged where violence is, right? And then if you don't want to see the blood and gore in the show, if there's blood and gore in the show, there's not this one, there is sex in it, I guess, because we'll see the scene skip. So it'll strategically skip 30 seconds or 22 seconds or whatever. And so anyway, that's if you want to watch those shows with kids, or if you have some moral objection to certain parts of the shows. This has allowed us to watch some shows we wouldn't otherwise watch that we've enjoyed. So VidAngel is my last pick. Alec, what are your picks?
Well, the first one I suppose I'm going to lift from you, Charles. I did a tiny bit of research. It's Terso. Terso is the SQLite
Ooh,
as
fun.
a service,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
they're maintaining libSQL, which is my understanding is it's intended to be a enhanced drop-in replacement for SQLite. It has slightly different goals, supports things like having a server. It's got a Rust layer if you're somebody who just is looking for a reason to study Rust code. So I think that's pretty interesting, both as a product and like as a project initiative. So I guess I'll shout that out. Since we're shouting out like general media stuff, I'll also shout out a podcast called Discomfortable. It's a little bit older. New episodes are being made, but if you're somebody who is in a place where you want to actualize a little bit more and get comfortable with your shame, it's an incredibly engaging podcast I found. I think it's helped me make some positive changes in my life. And so I want to, pay that forward and suggest to others that it may also be helpful for you. TV shows. This is a little bit old, but I loved the Theranos. I think that was a Hulu original series, limited series, very, very good. I also enjoyed, they had a limited series on Uber as well, that I thought was interesting. I've really been enjoying these like exposés on people who, scam others, like these big scams that happen to society. How do they happen? What are the motivations behind them? I don't know. I think that's interesting. And we're living, in the golden age of these. Another one is there was one that recently came out on Apple TV about the Beanie. I think it's called the Beanie Bubble, about Beanie Babies, the creator of Beanie Babies, and sort of how he did that. It's very interesting. I think you can come for the Beanie Babies and stay for a little deep dive into what to look for in unhealthy relationships, actually. So I'd recommend that as well. I think that's it for me.
All right, cool. If people want to connect with you on the internet, where do they find you?
I don't do social media, so you can find me on GitHub you can email me, hello@alec.ninja, which is also on my GitHub. Otherwise, I moved to Portland back in 2020, and the meetup scene hasn't really been very active here. I would say come find me at a meetup, but I don't know. I might change that. I'm thinking about toying with the idea of trying to revive at least one local meetup here. So maybe you can come find me in person at some point if you're in Portland.
Awesome. I should probably put out there that next month I intend to, in earnest, start doing a weekly meetup for Ruby and Rails developers. And it's just going to be a mix between sort of the social get to know you. Like 1 week will be that. 1 week I'll have somebody who's an expert in something, right? So if we wanted to talk about turbo and stimulus, right, I'd have somebody that is an expert in that come talk to us. I may present on something that I've picked up, learned, or want to talk to, or just answer questions. But I want to create that environment because the meetup scene here in Salt Lake is dead too. And it's like, look, this is the place where I get inspired by talking to people and go, oh, wow, that was cool, or how do I solve this? Well, they did this over here. Right. So I completely agree. It's going to be at rubygeniuses.com. So you can check that out as well. But yeah, I'm not ready to launch that yet. So
yeah, it's a big commitment to organize a meetup. I've never done it myself, but I've been kind of adjacent to people who were. Back when I lived in Omaha, the Omaha Ruby Meetup used to be hosted at one of my employers, and there's a lot of organizing that goes into it. Especially if you have like lightning talks. And, you're running a whole podcast, so there's a lot of organizing that goes into it. But I do think it's a positive thing for the people who attend. So
yeah, all right, cool. Well, I'll go ahead and end the stream here. Thanks for coming. Till next time, folks. Max out.